But welcome everyone to the first session of the APRU Asia Pacific Indigenous Studies Seminar Series. So this is the first of 5 that we will be having on a bi-weekly basis from now until late May. So we're very excited to have all of you and hope that you all can attend the future sessions as well. Today, we have our session will be focused on Indigenous design and property regimes. And I am very excited to have 2 amazing scholars, Dr. Fredy Grefa, who's a professor of the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Universidad San Francisco de Quito, and Dr. Luke Hespanhol, senior lecturer in design at the University of Sydney. So to get us started, we'll have Professor Grefa go ahead and give his presentation.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thanks for this opportunity. I am honored to be here in this seminar. Well, the title of my presentation is Indigenous Property Regimes, trying to talk about the planes de vida and the unsettling of property and dispossession. So the first thing that I would like to mention is the Quechua is my mother language, so English is like my third language. So if something is not clear, please let me know. I would like to express more easily so that you understand what I'm trying to say. So for the agenda for my presentation is about planes de vida, as I mentioned before, and the idea of the Naporuna property regimes. So as I mentioned before, I'm connecting from Ecuador in Quito, the capital, in South America, and because I think my country is facing the Pacific Ocean, and we are connected with the Asian Pacific seminar in relationship to the indigenous peoples. So just want to mention very quickly the area where I work or where is my research based. Specifically, is in the Amazon region, okay, or what we call the Ecuadorian Amazon. This area is the home of 11 ancient indigenous nations. We call ourselves indigenous nationalities. So it's very important that in this very small place, we have these different indigenous nationalities, and each of them they're different, different thinking, different ontologies, different territories. So, but what we have in common is that we are facing problems about, for example, colonization, the loss of our territory, our languages, and so on. In this presentation, I want to specifically talk about the planes de vida. This is a project that started in 2019. It was funded by the Ecuadorian government, specifically from in the Amazon region. It's a planning process specifically as a requirement or as a proposal from the Amazonian indigenous people's point of view. And the idea is to identify where to invest in infrastructure, socio-environmental projects, and institutional build-up to meet the needs of the Amazonian people. So in this project, Planes de Vida, I was able to work for about 3 months. And I would like to talk from my experience and what was the outcome of the efforts of creating this Planes de Vida. So as I mentioned before, my research area is in the northern part of the Ecuadorian Amazon, specifically in the province of Napo, in this part of the cursor, and also in Orellana. So I am a member of this indigenous nationality, which is called the Quechua of the Ecuadorian Amazon. But specifically in the Napo area, we are trying to call ourselves or identify ourselves as the Naporuna people, okay? And that's very important for me because this is where, according to researchers, is where our culture flourishes, especially in the area of Archidona and Tena. So today, if we look at this static map, is the political division of the province, Napo province. It involves 5 municipalities: El Chaco, Quijos, Archidona, Tena, and Carlos Julio Rosemena Tola. So what's happening with the process of constructing the planes de vida? So I would like to propose some of the critiques of the process according to my experience. So the first thing that I was able to witness is this cartographic language, which determined the process. For example, indigenous concepts, methodologies, and practice were absent. I was very disappointed of that. And the other thing is that because the project was funded by the government, it was given a timeline, for example, 1 year in order to finish the project, okay? The other problem was the formalities of the state. For example, we don't have many indigenous professionals, and it was difficult for those who don't have degrees that are required to participate in the project to be hired. So that's another thing that I was able to see. So in this sense, this expert's view specifically superimposed a white mestizo cartographic gaze onto Napo Runawans. I was able to participate in different meetings for the construction of planes de vida. And because of the experts were mostly white mestizos, and they say sometimes, okay, we have to continue with the project. And if there are not many indigenous professionals, we have to inhabit the process in some way for the benefit of the indigenous people, incorporating the indigenous worldview. Okay, so according to me, in some way, this erasure the indigenous sovereignty. I was wondering, how is that possible that we are planning the future, you know, in some way, the life of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon region, the Ecuadorian Amazon, but still were not, the presence of indigenous professionals were minimal. So for me, Planes de Vida was a good intentions gesture that kept the Napo Runa outside of the project plan in the future. And that's why I quit from the project process. I just worked for 2 or 3 months, and then I say, no, I don't want to work in this process because I felt unwelcome in this. So, but in the process, I had the opportunity to talk with different indigenous leaders and different indigenous professionals. So we were thinking about how can we indigenize the Planes de Vida. So we were thinking about the possibility to standardize the guidelines for the construction of Planes de Vida. For example, as I mentioned before, there are 11 indigenous nations, each of them with different proposals, ideas, point of view, and how can create a guidelines that can help to create a more organized, coherent document that really incorporates the view of the indigenous peoples. Also, how to build a lexicon, easy to understand for everyone, because we are going to work with indigenous communities, and we have to translate some of the concepts that we are finding or incorporating to show and to propose to the government or to international organizations. So among us, we were saying, okay, we have to be innovative in some ways. We have to create new theories, but those have to emphasize the Amazonian ontologies, because we also have a philosophical identities and operational practices. Especially, we were thinking that by doing this, we can maintain our identity. Always recognizing that identities is not like written on a stone and always is changing and adapting. And the optics of our own planning has to be always as the first priority, and that we need to incorporate methodologies from our own reflections. However, some indigenous leaders say, okay, we have to be very quickly in this process. We need money, we need funding for different programs, projects for the benefit of indigenous peoples. And we say yes, but we have also be careful because we need to guarantee full participation in the management of the territory. Because in some way, the indigenous issue from the Western point of view is like a laundry list. And sometimes it has become as a folklore, and we don't want that. We wanted a very structured, very carefully thinking proposals that really benefit the indigenous people's objectives. Other ideas were related to the regulations of the life plans or planes de vida. Saying, okay, what kind of regulations are we going to incorporate in this process? Maybe are the traditional practices, or we're going to create a new ones. So in this process of planes de vida with a group of colleagues from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, we were saying, okay, we have to in some way indigenize the planes de vida, okay? And we were thinking, and we were proposing some questions, for example. What will planes de vida communicate if they started from the language and ethics of the Naporuna instead of a state vision of Cartesian space? And also, how can these plans reconstruct territories to enable Naporuna future? So those were like, and we are still in the air trying to think, and hopefully in this kind of seminar, I can get some also insights maybe from your research or some ideas that you are proposing. So the planes de vida, specifically in the Napo province, was working with an indigenous organization named FOIN, which is the Federation of Indigenous Organizations of Napo. As you can see in this slide, for example, in the process of the diagnostic, we were able to map in this static map some of the communities that are part of these indigenous organizations. So we identify like 136 communities that are members of FOI. We calculate about 53,000 hectares, about 29,000 inhabitants as members of FOI. And we also have these numbers, like 65% of the communities have legal possession of lands. And from there, 36% of the families live on private owned lands, and 46% of families live on communal lands. So what is the problem? What is the problem and the main problem that we identified in the diagnostic process for the planes de vida in this organization for? So the problem is that there is a series of property regimes that have shaped current forms of land ownership in the Amazon, particularly for the Naporuna. As I mentioned before, there are communal or private land titling, communities without land titling, for example, or that are in the process of getting land titling, or communities under agreements. For example, there are communities who are supposedly, in quotation marks, you know, in part of protected areas, for example, in national park or in others. So they have to have this agreement with the government in a form of lease, so they can get management of the territory. Also, the question was how to claim access and recovery of these ancestral lands. And the other problem is the territorial continuity, because the idea is that indigenous territories becomes as a form of community islands, separate from each other. For example, very quickly, if we see in the map, in this static map, the communities in this part, for example, that I am showing to you, If their community wants to continue practicing harvesting, fishing, or hunting, if they move beyond those territorial limits, they are in trouble. Okay, so in some way, these areas become islands or community islands, without having the opportunity to reproduce their traditional practice at larger scale. Okay. So in some way, planes de vida repeat the settlement of islands, induce infrastructure, and also reinforce extractive programs and conservation schemes in some way to control these disenfranchised traditional territorialities from hunting, fishing, and disconnect people from their forest societies. Here is another map that we work, and specifically the idea here is to show that there are some communities that involves what the government call bloques petroleros or oil blocks. Indigenous communities in some way, they don't know that their territory are involved those oil blocks. And some of them are facing the oil industry, or other are in the process of future negotiation with the entrance or the rejection of oil industry in their territories. So with all this context, personally, I was wondering, okay, what will happen, or do really Naporuna people have a sense of property or not in relationship to the territory? Just, I don't want to focus on the definition of property, but for the Western canon, property defines rights and obligations under the law. And in some cases, this also induces this scheme of land appropriation, because maybe the requirement for indigenous communities is that if they don't convert those territories for land use schemes, for example, agriculture, the government can just easily require those for other colonization purposes. So in order to understand the sense of property among indigenous people, or the Naporuna people, I had to disentangle historical narratives. My people, we don't have a writing system, so narratives are transmitted over generations, expressed in myths, for example, songs, arts, and now in new forms of cultural manifestations which help us to gain insight into indigenous people's claim about their territorialities. So in other words, historical narratives constitute a form of seeing property. In this sense, the idea of Naporuna property regimes is defined in terms of relations with nature and its mobile capacities, which are kept going through the intergenerational storytelling. The other idea is that indigenous people, even today, have continued practicing their traditional process of territorialization, even after the conquest. Okay, so for that reason, for the Naporuna, property is about complex, mobile, socio-environmental relationship among people and nature. For us, territory is understood in both spatial and temporal terms. For example, if we say spaces move with annual environmental changes, for example, when the river overflows on the banks, the bloom of trees, and thus hunting prey moves with seasonality as well, which affect the obligations and responsibilities of the Naporuna people. As mobile societies, we depend on finding places with plenty of food for hunting, fishing, and harvesting, but also places to escape from slavery, illness, and control. So for us to continue existing as ancient culture, our social responsibilities and attachments are oriented towards securing this continuity. So the other idea is to propose the idea of property as interaction. I would like to mention this something from a personal experience. For example, my grandfather, whose name was Jose Andy, was a Yachak. Translated in other language can be as a channel. Okay. So when I was a child, I used to visit him in the forest, and he used to trace an imaginary safe territory or territoriality for us. He used to point out, for example, some big trees, the river shoreline, and the specific places that were safer for us. He used to say, if you move beyond those spaces, you can be harmed, you can be killed, because he has many enemies or other Yachak that would like to kill him, sending this, what he calls the chuntapala, or the palm's spear. So the forms of property might be seen as a relation between people and things, but also the relation of things, nature, and the spiritual expressions of a people. And the materiality that makes the property regime in his example can be sensed as the death or illness of those who entered into the dominion of the Yachak, or the dominion of certain sacred places, such as caves or mountains in the forest. So finally, what I would like to mention in this conversation, and hopefully I can get some insights, recommendations, and critiques, is that for the Naporuna people, all the forest is the Naporuna's home, okay? And their mobility is whether they want to go. And the territoriality is related to the dominion of the shaman, sacred spaces, or natural claims, for example, flooding areas. Nowadays, the people still travel elsewhere around the Amazon for hunting, fishing, or visiting friends or family to continue reproducing their old territorialities and creating new ones. So the idea here is that to recognize property not as fixed, but as mobile, dependent on the flow of the river, or on sacred areas, or on the presence of meat or the blooms of trees, what I call sacharuna, or maybe more translated as socio-environment. So these complex forms of seeing property by the Naporuna is what Planes de Vida should take into account in its design metrics and values. So I just gave you some of the ideas that, because of my experience and what other indigenous peoples, indigenous leaders are concerned, we were trying to say, really, what are the opportunities for us to claim ancient territories and to have the opportunity to manage the territories in a larger scale. So this is, I think, the issue that from the Western point of view is not taking account specifically for the planning process. And this Planes de Vida, which is supposed to benefit, indigenous peoples, or the objectives of indigenous people, should also incorporate. So this is my presentation, and I would like to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Grefa. That was an amazing presentation. And I'm sorry I didn't mention this earlier, but these workshops are really designed to get feedback on the works in progress that we're presenting here. And so I'd really love to open the floor to all of here present for your feedback, for your questions and discussion. Would anyone like to start? And maybe Professor Grefa, would you mind just sharing maybe some ideas of where you'd like to take this work next, or like how you would like to build upon the work that you've already started? I think you're on mute. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was just wondering if there are Indigenous treaties present for the Indigenous people. They have treaties with the government for the land, especially in relation to oil. Land rights. Yeah. Thanks.
Professor Grefa?
Can you repeat the question, please?
I was just wondering where Indigenous people stand in relation to land rights and the oil money, basically, and use of the land. Thanks.
Yes, yeah, the Ecuadorian Amazon is the oil industry began in the 60s. So specifically in the northern part of the Ecuadorian Amazon, for example, in the areas of Orellana, Sucumbíos, and indigenous peoples in these places have experienced dealing, having some agreement with the oil industry. At the beginning, the presence of the state was minimal, or in some cases absent, but they were able to defend their territories. Now, for example, the government decide in some way that the oil industry is fundamental for the development of the projects as Ecuador. So they were facing different problems, land expropriation. For example, indigenous leaders were in a form of negotiation by themselves without consulting the entire community. So there are many processes. So seeing that experience in the southern part of the Ecuadorian Amazon, indigenous peoples, for example, I don't know if you have heard the Sarayaku people, they are opposed completely to the presence or to the entrance of the oil industry in their territories. So yes, there are, in order to facilitate the oil industry, the government sometimes just force, in some cases, the entrance of the oil companies. I don't know if I was able to respond to your question, but
no, I just, yeah. Sorry.
Yes.
I often see in the media people, like indigenous people, protesting about the oil. Yes, and claiming, you know, not being able to claim their land.
Yes, that's the reason that I think the idea is how do we claim our land rights, not only based on what the law says, but maybe in our traditional practices. For example, hunting, fishing, harvesting, our relationship with the mountains, with sacred areas, things like that. So those are the practices that they still are being reproduced in some parts of the communities. And it's very important for us. So I want to acknowledge and recover those values in order to give another scope for the analysis of what territory means and how indigenous understand property in the terms of, for example, Napuruna people. So my question for the participants here is, how are other, I don't know, examples how indigenous peoples in other places are using, or what kind of arguments, concepts they are using in order to claim access to territory or access to their lands.
And please feel free to speak up and open your microphone if you'd like to answer that question.
I'm in Australia, and in Victoria, one of the southern states, they're starting to negotiate a treaty, but there aren't any treaties here. And I'm interested in the that New Zealand have the Waitangi Treaty, which has helped them quite a lot with their land rights. So yeah, it's very varied in this country, I think. I think a treaty is a very good idea. They're trying to change the constitution, but I think a treaty comes before a constitution change, personally. Thanks.
Yes, I think is that a very good argument of using the treaties, but in the case of Latin America, the doctrine of conquest, saying that all the lands belong to the Spaniards conquistadores, saying that the indigenous people didn't have any rights to claim to those lands. So in those cases, we as indigenous scholars, we are trying to dismantle these concepts and saying that is, even though the Spanish conquistadores, they claim those lands belonged to them, indigenous people still practice some indigenous traditional forms of relating to the land, okay? In the form of hunting, fishing, relating to the sacred areas, many things that in details I cannot tell you, but still are some important practices that we need to uncover in order to claim our territories and our practices at a larger scale. So that's the one of the I think themes that we have to discuss more in details, but as indigenous peoples, just together and have one very strong position. Otherwise, we are going to still losing our territories in order to support, you know, the building of the state, for supporting the program projects for the benefit of, in the name of the all Ecuadorians.
One thing that I can say, I was really interested to hear that you mentioned the 1960s as the time when the oil development was probably in full swing, which is the same for us. I'm from Alaska, I'm Denina Athabascan, and we didn't have treaties signed with the United States government in Alaska. There was one signed between Russia and Alaska when we were sold. But in terms of things that I see indigenous peoples doing in North America, but also in New Zealand, is the idea of working to grant personhood to environmental entities like rivers, for example, are the two things that come to mind. And there's the Klamath River here in Northern California, Oregon, and then the Wanganui River, right, in New Zealand. It's something that, for those of us that have been dehumanized for centuries and denied rights as indigenous peoples, as indigenous nations, that there's usually, especially in the Arctic, there's this push to conserve the land, conserve the water, save the polar bears, but not so much attention to indigenous peoples. And so it might be one strategy. And I would love to hear if you know of any moves or actions that way in your communities, in terms of thinking about, if the people are going to be overlooked, maybe that going to grant personhood to the lands, waters, environments might be kind of a different way to go. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, as I mentioned before, because of the diversity of indigenous nations in the Amazon, each of them, they have their own history, culture, ideas, how they relate to the state, things like that. So there are some efforts. For example, the indigenous people from Sarayaku, they are proposing some very interesting concepts. For example, the Causa Isacha, or the living forest, giving this kind of personhood to the whole forest, you know, as a sacred entity. And there is another idea that is this organization called COICA, which involves all the 9 countries in the Amazon basin. They are proposing this project Cuencas Sagradas, or the sacred basin, that involves rivers, trees, humans, many things, and also the non-humans. So there are many ideas, but still they try to approximate a process of the recognition of, for example, as a protected area, in the case of the Sarayaku, an approximation of a protected area. But in what will happen in other places or in other communities, as I mentioned, there is where there are no territorial continuity, okay? So they are proposing some, like in the corridors, for example, so planning process about zoning in different areas, so they can be more attached to the geographic area. So trying to incorporate sacred areas, mountains, very specific things that are particular to those places. So Yes, we are still in the process, but we, as I mentioned before, we need to incorporate some theories or concepts that gave us the idea to start, giving some exchange of suggestions. How can get better arguments to support or to protect or to claim territorial rights?
It may be also worth pointing out, just from Aotearoa, New Zealand, that the legal personhood acts for the Wanganui River and the Urewera Mountains doesn't constrain local bodies from issuing consents to extractive companies, right? So there's still that fundamental issue around private property rights and the rights of companies leveraging off those private property rights, even within, I mean, I'm not saying it's not a really good step forward, but there's still significant issues around mana motuhake in the New Zealand context, or self-determination and the ability for Indigenous people to take control of those processes is still what feels like quite a long way away. Because you're still operating within a Western system through an active parliament. It's still based on an ontological worldview that will support an extractive methodology, an extractive business over environmental health or non-tangible benefits.
Yes, I think it's a very complicated process. There are many efforts of specifically led by indigenous grassroots organizations. And but as I mentioned before, this is also political. There are some negotiation with the government, indigenous leaders who are corrupted by the money, by the personal interests. So there are many things happening. So as a scholar, as a researcher, I am very interested in how to support, because they are always asking me, what should we do? What kind of negotiation we should follow, in order to protect our people. Our indigenous leaders, they don't have the experience, they don't have the knowledge as we would like in order to have a better outcomes for our people. So sometimes they are influenced by, I don't know, radical environmental organizations, or maybe because they are funded by, I don't know, different NGOs. So my wish is to have more indigenous professionals, and we, as in this place, more collaborative, so we can share ideas. And for example, in the case of New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, and the United States, I have read many articles of what we are doing, but we want to also build our own experience and create our own concepts. It's difficult, but I think we are starting, and I am very happy that I am seeing the probably outcomes of that.
I was interested in in an earlier part in your presentation, you talked about the languaging that's used in planning, like the kind of the professional language that's used in planning, and looking at how to kind of fully move away from that and looking at the community and the history and the ways of doing things for the Indigenous peoples. Is that something that's being done with people, with those communities? Is that or are you, it's just such a difficult thing, like not to translate, but actually to ground in the community's experiences, or in the case of New Zealand, the tikanga, the kawa, the kind of the way of doing things. Could you go into that in a little more detail?
Yes. As I mentioned before, the Planes de Vida project was funded by the central national government. And they funded, and in the process, they require that the people who are going to be coordinating the programs, the project, has to have some expertise, you know, in planning, analyzing data, things like that. So the problem was that we, as I mentioned before, we don't have many indigenous professionals. Fortunately, in my university, I think here is David Romo, my professor. He is, my university is also having this program in which gives the opportunity to indigenous people, to indigenous professionals to finish their degrees, okay? So I am the first, one of the first who will benefit from this program at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito. And hopefully, I think in the process, we will have more indigenous professionals involving and leading this kind of planning process for the benefit of indigenous peoples. But right now, as I mentioned before, it was just white mestizos experts deciding the future of indigenous people. So I was really worried about that process, and that's why I renounced, I quit from that, my participation, because I didn't feel welcome, and most of the ideas was that I wanted to articulate as is this idea of indigenous property regimes. They didn't understand that. So I say, no, we don't have time to discuss that. Those concepts, we just need to follow the requirements to finish to identify programs, projects, and we need the funding to run very quickly.
But do you also find there's not an appetite for younger people to join professions that are so kind of grounded in those methodologies, those colonial methodologies? They just don't want to. They don't want to do the degrees.
Yes, they just did. For example, some of the concepts that they were trying to discuss was the idea of the pluriverse, for example. I don't know if you have heard about that. That's coming from, you know, white people trying to idealize what is the best thing for indigenous people. But for example, we have had other forms of methodologies, other forms of governance in our territories. So they didn't want to incorporate those. So they were thinking just how, what kind of investment, the money that they need to just to get funded in the very short, in the short term.
So I'd like to make sure that we have enough time to invite our next scholar to present his work, but I do see there's a couple of hands raised. Would you mind just going ahead and ask your questions very quickly, and then we can get started with our next presentation. So Katina, please go ahead.
I think David was first. Please go ahead, David.
Well, first, congratulations to Fredy. I'm really, really proud of seeing how something that that began as a conflict in his previous job made him go towards a PhD solution, and that's really enriching. But one of the things I wanted to challenge Fredy about is the other indigenous peoples that live in the Amazon basin of Ecuador have continuous territories, and the Quechua are divided into community territories, and they don't unify as a whole. Do you see that as one of the weaknesses of the Quechua people in terms of negotiation? Because it's easier to break up smaller pieces than to break up a whole thing. It's not like fighting with the Shuar or the Waurani. So that's my short question.
Hola, David. Yes, I think it's a very good question. And as I mentioned before, we have to analyze those in the context, historical context, how the Naporuna people has been faced to the colonial regimes, you know, to the colonization process, you know, the appropriation of the lands, specifically in the Amazon region. The creation of the haciendas, or for example, this process of reducciones, parcialidades, imposed by the Spaniards conquistadores. has been in some way replicating those practices even today. Okay, so that's why we have like a separation of indigenous, for example, in the Quito of the Amazon, there are not continuity or territorial continuity as other, for example, in the case of the Waorani, of the Shuars or the Achuars, they have larger tracts of territories. And also another problem, as you mentioned, is that among the indigenous Quechua or the Quechua people, there are just in Napo, we have like 7 indigenous Quechua organizations. Can you imagine 7 indigenous organizations? So the Constitution talks about the creation of nationalities, but the problem if their indigenous people have their own, the leadership is based on their own interests and not in the interest of to unify and fight together. Those are also problems. Just for the building of the Planes de Vida in Napo, they were fighting for their resources, for the funding, and for technicians. So I don't want to talk more about, but yes, it's there, and hopefully we find a solution and unified as one nation, as the Quechua or the Naporuna people.
Thank you. Katina?
Yes, thank you. Just very quickly, I just wondered whether you had given thought to where the children, the indigenous children, are situated in all of this discussion, because I think a couple of things. One, their voice, because this is their future as well, and this is their, this is their land. And giving some thought to how you might harness the power of the children's voice, particularly given that across the globe for a number of years now, we have seen children advocate and make significant ground on a number of big issues, particularly when it comes to climate change and a whole bunch of things we've seen, the rights of female children to be educated. And I wonder whether, thinking about how you could harness the indigenous children's voices in all of this, that you're doing, and position them as powerful in moving things forward and hearing about what they want for their future and how they see all of these things related to them and how they're going to live their lives and continue to do all the things that the indigenous traditions and everything continuing on into the future. So I'll leave that with you.
It's a really great question, and I'd love for Professor Grefa to keep thinking about this as you're developing your work. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Luke Hespanhol from the University of Sydney, Senior Lecturer in Design. Please go ahead and take the stage.
Thank you, Jackie, for the introduction. I'd like to share my screen and just make sure that everybody can hear me well and can see my screen. Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you all and to be a part of this inaugural session for this series, and also a pleasure to hear from Fredy about his experiences in Ecuador. I'm based in Australia, so I'm a senior lecturer in design at the University of Sydney. My talk comes from a slightly different direction, or very different direction, should I say. So my practice is in interaction design. So I deal mostly with digital technologies in relation to the environment, in relation to designing interactions between people mediated by technology, and also community engagement with technology. So that constitutes a large part of my research to date. And I've, over the years, became well aware and growingly aware of the underlying colonial signatures that play out in the field of digital technologies, and the assumptions that you make in terms of their importance, their relevance, and their appropriateness across different contexts. The issues with supply chain and the depletion of the environment, that's done to support the ecosystem of digital technologies around the world, and the dire consequences to land and to indigenous peoples and cultures. Particularly here in Australia, I think we are long overdue for a reckoning in terms of our practices in that regard, and how should we reposition ourselves going forward. So that's what motivated this initial inquiry, and this came out from a research project that I was developing last year with one of my research students here at the University of Sydney. Her name is Sienna White, and also driven by high school here, the School of Architecture, Design and Planning, trying to indigenizing research and curricula, and trying to revisit our practices from from a perspective of welcoming, but also most importantly, learning from indigenous knowledge systems, and how could we change ours in order to be more culturally aware and less destructive as an academic organization. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the land where I'm standing in. This is literally the view outside my office here. It's called Cargill Green here in the University of Sydney campus, and it used to be his name in honor of the Cargill people of the Eora Nation, who are still here, who still live here, and this used to be a water source used by millennia by the Cargill people here. It's part of our campus now, and it's a duty to acknowledge that this is still Aboriginal land. Sovereignty has never been ceded. This is still Cargill land, and I acknowledge the tradition and the custodianship and law of the country of where our campuses actually stand. And I pay my respects to those who have cared and continue to care for a country. And again, I feel really privileged to be able to work here and to live in other Aboriginal lands near Sydney. Again, this is still Aboriginal land. They're still here. It's not a university, although the university stands and operates here. I should also acknowledge, again, as I was telling before, this comes from this pilot research. So it's very much a work in progress, driven by our desire to revisit our practices of design and design methods and design with technology from a perspective, from Australian perspective, engaging with Australian Indigenous communities, but also learning from Indigenous communities elsewhere. So our tentative title was towards a framework for design digital technology with country. So we're not claiming that we have a solution or we have a definitive answer. Quite the opposite. It is the purpose of this research was to start a conversation with the community and also with Indigenous scholars and Indigenous practitioners and Indigenous communities. And this research has been, we've written a paper and we've submitted to this Design Research Society conference, which is going to happen next June in Bilbao. It got accepted, and that makes us believe that there is a growing momentum in interest for practices that would disseminate better approaches to design that would be respectful of country and people and law. I should also position ourselves within this work. We, unlike Professor Fredy Grefa, we are not Indigenous. Neither myself nor Sienna, my student who I developed this research with, we are not Indigenous. We have mixed backgrounds, both of us. I actually come from South America as well. I was born and raised in Brazil, being a migrant to Australia, living here for many, many years, almost 20 years now, but from an European background. And Sienna, my co-author, is born in Australia from a mix of European and South Asian backgrounds. So we didn't grow within an Indigenous culture, although I grew up in South America, in Brazil, and even then I was never really exposed to Indigenous cultures in Brazil. All the knowledge that I have was self-driven and collected way years after I actually left the country. It is still very much a colonial society, and I think the talk by Professor Fredy actually echoes the situation in South America as more broadly. So none of us are Indigenous. We don't claim to speak on behalf of Indigenous people. We try to consult as much as possible, and that's part of the motivation for this and also the outcome of this. But in any way, we claim that what we are proposing here is final, is definitive, and is reflective of how things should actually be. This is our first effort, and we come to this effort in good faith, eager to learn, and very humbly opening up for criticism and for alternative points that would, we believe, enrich our practice. The idea is, again, driven from the efforts of our university, which to contribute to building stronger relationships between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, particularly within design practices. But because as designers, we are often reaching out to society and working with different contexts and peoples that we are not familiar with, that becomes even more important, especially in the context of Australia and other colonial countries where indigenous people have been not heard or not heard enough over the centuries. And then we'd like to contribute those insights into the ways in which interactive designers in particular can change the design process to prioritize country. Hopefully this delivers some initial contributions to that effort. I'm using here country with capital C. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with this, but definitely those of you in Australia. For the benefit of those watching this recording later on, I was just going to elaborate very briefly why do we use country with a capital C. So in the context of indigenous cultures in Australia and New Zealand, country is the whole that unifies everything in life, that goes beyond just the landscape and also incorporates the myths, the stories, the elders, the artifacts, the relationships between people and everything around them. So in the words of Daniel Romack, who is a UN woman and a professor here in our school, the lands of countries represent the lands to which First Peoples belong, yearn for, find healing from, and will return to. And quoting here the government architect of New South Wales document, which I'm going to mention later on, has been developed in consultation with Indigenous scholars. Countries living is constantly changing and evolving. Many ecosystems exist across different realms of country, including both living and no-living elements. Country has purpose, operating at multiple scales from the cosmic to the molecular and everything in between. And that context is really crucial for any effort in designing with, for, and or informed by indigenous communities, right? Just understand the relationality and how one thing relates to the other and impacts the other and informs each other, and how this is sit within the broader context of country. Understanding that is really important because as designers, we often have a very tunnel vision that we look at the solution and very narrow design needs from particular users, and we introduce new artifacts into the world without greater appreciation for its impact and the ripple effects all around. So the very first thing is to get this understanding very clearly that when I talk about country, we are really talking about the network of relationships and the interdependence between everything that exists around us. There has been quite a lot of work done in this field, particularly in Australia. And that's how we started our inquiry. So by reviewing some of this previous research that has been conducted academically, in particular with indigenous communities. What we found, though, is that first of all, most of that research has been done by non-indigenous scholars, and of course, we are in a way contributing to that. But also, we felt that there was this, the process was almost like reinvented every single time. So it started from scratch, trying to gain cultural awareness and reconnect with particular communities, and it was very much looked at in isolation. So there was this gap, we felt, of a unified framework or a broadly defined framework that could inform new endeavors, new projects that may come up. And it could define like this a set of guidelines that what should actually be done in preparation for those efforts, and what actually should be done during those efforts, how we should really engage with indigenous communities when we're designing for them, and rather designing with them and under their leadership. But we couldn't find it anywhere, really. So we thought that, well, maybe a good starting point would be to expand on those insights from the literature so far, particularly in the literature in human-computer interaction, which is the field I normally do my research under, and then validate and expand those insights through the analysis of the many emerging Australian frameworks that are being put together by governments, by organizations, and by Indigenous scholars themselves across different fields of design, ranging from landscape architecture, built environment, spatial design, and artificial intelligence, or even digital design more broadly. There's a lot of new material coming up that has come up in the past 2-3 years, which again speaks for this growing momentum of particularly Indigenous scholars regaining or trying to regain some voice in the discourse. And we thought, well, that's a good starting point for our analysis. So I'm going to talk about the steps in more detail later on, but this is just a general illustration of a methodology which consisted of a literature review and then shortlisting some sources that we found to be relevant for this particular project we are developing. And then trying to extract guidelines and principles from all the different sources, conduct some affinity diagram exercises, so try to find overlappings and commonalities between those proposed guidelines and methods, so that you arrive at a list of precepts and principles for the design of digital technology with country, and also a list of methods and a potential proposed timeline for a design process. So I'm going to elaborate on those points as I progress through my presentation. But importantly here, this is a cyclical process, right? Again, the end result that we're going to present here, it's not by any means final. It's rather the opposite. It's just a starting point. There are many more iterations that should come after this one, and not necessarily by us. I mean, ideally, actually, would be done by others, and we would contribute to the discussions. So we started out with, as I said, a broader literature review of the new frameworks in design that we identified mostly from the past 3-4 years. As you can see here, there were about 11 sources that we found we identified as being of interest. There was new publications more in terms of the broader design field, like the International Indigenous Design Charter, and also a book by Alison Page and Paul Memot, Design, Building on Country. I'm going to talk a bit more about it. There were publications or reports more specific to the built environment, including some from the New South Wales government here in Australia, but also from Indigenous scholars like Engaging with Country from Daniel Romack. There were new publications around digital design and driven largely by Anja Bila, who is an Indigenous woman here from Australia, who has done an amazing job in trying to articulate artificial intelligence, in particular in the context of decolonization. And then we found also some institutional frameworks that were being released, including from our own university, who has released the updated version of the art design principles. It's called Walanga Nkaramura in 2020. We also worked with a new art center in Lake Macquarie, the Lake Macquarie region here of New South Wales, which is about 2 hours north of Sydney, which is our Abakal country. So that's the peoples who live there, Indigenous peoples who live in that area. And together they developed this, what's called Yapang framework, to involve particularly the cultural sector and the GLAM, so museum sector, around Lake Macquarie here. And we've been collaborating with them in other fronts, so that became a natural source to get inspirations from. What we found, though, is that the institutional reports were usually too high level for the purposes of informing more the design processes that we normally operate in terms of creating artifacts and co-designing with communities. So a bit too high level, so we didn't follow up with those. And then we went through the process of shortlisting the other sources in terms of selecting those that would be representative from each one of the other fields. And that led us to a short list of 6 publications that then we took forward to inform analysis. I'm going to talk briefly about each one of them and the key points from each one of them. So the first one is connecting with country draft framework, which has been elaborated by the government architect of New South Wales. This is a group that is responsible for outlining policies and principles, pathways, commitments for action intended to help design, delivering government infrastructure, informed by informed design approaches. This particular document offered two strategies broadly. So first of all, any effort should be rooted in cultural awareness, and that involves learning about Indigenous cultures, but also experiencing and engaging with Indigenous peoples. And that would go hand in hand with considering the whole project life cycle from an Aboriginal perspective. So revisiting every single step and being critical about every single step from the learnings, with the learnings from the cultural awareness process. This is a cyclical process. Again, the two things go hand in hand, they're interrelated and inform each other, or should inform each other throughout the project development. And one thing that we found quite useful is that they put forward this reframing of a design process from a country perspective. So what we normally would call forming, which is like getting acquainted with the context, and they reframe it as a sensing. So it's way more body-based and experientially based, and taking into account everything that is around the whole of country. So sensing, and then rather than just designing, we are imagining potential futures. The process of delivery becomes shaping the country, and the process of maintaining technology or design in general becomes a process of caring for a country, which includes caring for the people who are part of the country. So we thought that that would be quite an interesting starting point, and then we moved on to the second source, the Indigenous Protocol for Indigenous Protocols and Artificial Intelligence, which has been put together as a result from a workshop of Indigenous and non-Indigenous authors that happened in Hawaii a few years ago, including people from Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, North America, and the Pacific communities. And their goal was to start to discuss the design of artificial intelligence in particular from an ethical position that was centered on Indigenous concerns. They presented a range of ideas in acknowledgement that different Indigenous communities may have their own particular approach to technology, but also how technology might operate within their contexts, and if it is appropriate or not to begin with. And pointing out to the risk that if we maintain a Western lens on design technology, there's a risk of not fully grasping what the technology could be, and worse, perpetuating biases and prejudices already instilled in technologies. Coming back to my the first point of my talk. And they embarked on that project in an effort to start a productive conversation with Indigenous communities around collaborative technology design efforts. That also connects to another effort, the International Indigenous Design Charter, that had a more, so to speak, professional look from a professional practice, a more commercial considerations. So considerations about the commercial expression of Indigenous knowledges in the design practice and the care that should be taken during the process, and offering best practices for designers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to observe when working with Indigenous knowledge in commercial practices. Most importantly, and jump to the final point here, projects must be Indigenous-led, especially if they're going to affect Indigenous communities, right? Reinforcing the rights of Indigenous peoples to be self-determined. So the account that Professor Grefa actually made during his talk, I think would be echo with this final point here. The project should have been Indigenous-led as an act of self-determination, not the other way around. And in design, particularly with technology, that has been the tone all along, right? It's almost like an imposed solutions with good intentions, as mentioned, often with good intentions, but without enough knowledge and awareness of the potential appropriateness and consequences. The The source number 4 that we selected is a beautiful book by Alison Page and Paul Memot, which I hinted at before. It's called Design Building on Country. It is a lot about architecture and urban planning, but it does offer some new ways of thinking about design that could be country focused. So we found that it would be appropriate to us as well to incorporate some of those guidelines into the practice of design technology. They proposed this idea of a unique new Australian design that would be informed by Indigenous knowledge systems that could improve the well-being of people and create places of greater meaning for all Australians. And they proposed those 3 core principles of paying attention to functionality, sustainability, and storytelling, crucially, that would work together to define this Indigenous design. And then they also provide 5 considerations which we revisit as design principles, as I'm going to mention later on. Basically, design, deep listening, the fact that projects should be Indigenous-led, they should be community-specific, the benefits should be shared with the communities, and Indigenous knowledge must be respected all along. The 5th source that we consider is it's a publication by Daniel Romek, who is a professor here in the University of Sydney in high school. It's titled Engaging with Country, and offers an approach for engaging with country, culture, and community as part of planning, designing, and environmental management disciplines based on an Indigenous worldview and looking at the process of unlearning anthropocentric and relearning country-centered behavior. And what we found quite useful is that she proposed 3 methods which are driven by phenomenology pretty much. So it's a first-person lens engagement to research and to understanding of country, which she referred to as hearing country, sensing country, and walking country. And that has been providing the basis for any initial engagement with country that designers should undertake. The final source I'd like to talk about from literature is titled Beyond Imperial Tools, and it's by Angie Abdillah. Again, she's a designer professor at UNSW here in Australia. She also has her own practice. It's called Old Ways New, which has been very active and very influential in providing wisdom about Indigenous knowledge systems, and particularly with technology, to inform the discourses in our field. And the first point that she made, of course, is that modern technologies are not culturally neutral, and Western technology in particular is founded in the logic of extractive colonialism. That colonial thinking has continued the development of technologies that fuel inequality and unsustainable usage models. And then ancient Aboriginal technologies embody sustainable solutions, driven by, particularly by Aboriginal governance and law, driven by country. And if we incorporate those practices as part of the design thinking that we adopt in projects, that could lead to a new code of ethics to inform the design of technologies in contemporary contexts. So based on all that, what we've done, as I mentioned before, we start to collect and list all those different recommendations and guidelines and suggestions and thoughts and precepts, and run an affinity diagram exercise to identify themes that would bring them together, cluster them together. And we did that for each one of those 6 sources. Then once we have those first level themes, we start to reiterate that process, to group them together into what we call precepts. So we formulate, we phrase them as precepts based on quotes from the different sources. So this is an example. So allow local Aboriginal people to oversee the design process and determine the representation of their culture. So it's a precept that should be taken into account all along during any design process. And so we repeated this with all the different guidelines that we identified through the literature sources. And then we came up with a list of 40 precepts that would reflect different aspects provided by those literature sources. They overlap to a certain degree. That's what we noticed. So we carried on the exercise yet again. So we start to look at the list of 40 precepts which are valuable by themselves, but we also start to cluster them together into higher level recommendations, which we call design principles. So that sort of illustrates our design process here, methodology process. To start with the literature sources, listing all the recommendations that we could identify from them, cluster them together into this list of 40 precepts, and then iterating that affinity diagram exercise once again to group them together into a list of 15 design principles. Those 15 design principles, which you can see here on the screen, which I will be happy to talk in more detail during the conversation later on. They would offer mechanisms for not only a direction for the design process, things that should be observed, but also a way of perform quality check during the design process and make sure that it's still on track, is still respectful of country, and still paying attention to aspects that should be paid attention to. So we have things from ensuring self-determination to an active deep listening, all the way down to designing for the well-being of country and the people who live with a part of country, and also the importance of storytelling for the design process and storytelling from an indigenous perspective. But also things like embedding cultural awareness, ensuring there's transparency and accountability, and respecting social customs and distinct worldviews, and so on. The other thing we derived from the literature sources was suggestions for methods about how to enact design with country. So we just start listing them together as well. And the idea was to complement what we know in non-Indigenous circles as design thinking or design methods that have been mostly put together in Western contexts. So we thought, this could provide a counterpart, balance that out and provide methods that would be more appropriate to this engagement of design with country. Most of them would provide suggestions about how to engage in cultural awareness and then community engagement, collaboration, co-creation with and co-production with Indigenous communities. But also that some of them could speak about, again, this first-person engagement with country, with everything around us, and with the learning process that's intrinsic to this effort. So we also connect them to some non-Indigenous methods or methods that already exist in so-called design thinking canon, like sound maps or local orbits, or Christophe Giraud's for trace methods that's using landscape architecture, which is all about having this first-person interpretation of a context, a physical context, and then seeking learning by the process of finding, grounding, finding and founding. And then we also found, okay, some of them needs to be done in consultation with Indigenous communities, but some of them should happen before that and would demand the designer to learn about Indigenous culture, to perform cultural awareness. It could be done very well by themselves. It could be self-initiated. Processes and methods that demand consultation take time, demand space, and proper effort and proper engagement. So, and that has implications for the design timeline, of course, but they are essential. But there are a few things that could be done, by the designers themselves without consultation necessarily, in order to bring them up to speed, so to speak, in terms of Indigenous protocols. And some of them could be done ideally in consultation, but if that's not possible, could also be self-initiated. Some of them need to be done on country, so you have to be situated where you're going to design for, and some of them needs to be done many times during the design process. Bring this all together, we elaborate an initial proposal for a design framework, which contains a timeline for a project, the list of principles that should be respected and adhered to, and a list of methods that could be used to enact principles. We divided the design timeline into those 5 stages based on the Government Act of New South Wales document, Design with Country, starting with cultural awareness and then going through the stages of sensing, imagining, shaping, and then caring for country, and then having it as a cyclical process that's informed by the literature. And in doing so, we hope to have an initial understanding for ourselves, but also for the design community of what could be done in terms of design methods for engaging with technology with country, how those methods should be performed, when should they be performed, and why, in terms of the design principles that would increase their chances of being culturally appropriate. So this is a final contribution at this stage. As I mentioned before, it's very much a work in process. There is, this is my final slide. There are some caveats that need to be observed, but hopefully also some benefits. So the first caveat is that this framework is, again, it's very much a work in process. It should not be generalized to all Indigenous communities or contexts, but it's rather community specific or applied in a community specific way, and being refined in consultation with the Indigenous communities that are involved in the process. And practical applications of the framework are still required for validation. We have a project we may be initiating, we hope to be initiating in the next few months, which we are going to use to validate this initial set of proposals here with one local Aboriginal community, the Awabako community in Lake Macquarie that I mentioned before. But hopefully this already offers some food for thought in terms of greater sensibility, especially for non-Indigenous designers, about protocols of engagement with Indigenous communities and country. Hopefully that it can lower the risk of misunderstandings and the perpetuation of colonizing practice in design. And hopefully, again, it can establish some mutual expectations regarding consultation and co-design, at least have some form of soft contract from a design perspective that could be used as to start the conversation and establish the practices for each particular project. So with that, I'd like to conclude my talk and thank you all again. And I really look forward to hear from you, your thoughts, your reactions, and also your potential criticism to what we're doing, because we're really, really open and welcome to grow that for the benefit of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous designers, if possible. So thank you.
Yes, please. Please go ahead and speak up. We only have a few minutes left, so I don't want to delay the conversation much more. So please feel free to ask your questions and offer your insights.
A question about Indigenous music. A lot of young Indigenous people are making their own music as an art form, and not necessarily in an urban setting. How does that fit in with your type of project?
It doesn't have to be urban setting. I think although I do normally work within urban settings, I think it's by country. We don't necessarily refer to, of course, only the countryside or urban settings. Is wherever the communities are based at. And I think this is particularly important with young Aboriginals individuals, right? Because they more than anyone are exposed to new technologies and are exposed to the narratives that inform those technologies. So, and it may be conflicting even for them, right? I mean, that's an interesting conversation because there are perceived benefits of engaging through technology for promoting culture, for disseminating Indigenous knowledge, and that should be encouraged, but without losing sight from the critical aspects of the potential unintended consequences of technology for country, culture, law, and people. So just keeping that conversation, the two conversations going, is the benefit and accessibility and inclusion, digital inclusion in society, which is really, really important and deficient, I would say, in Australia at this stage. But also being critical about, is that really appropriate? Is it really necessary for those communities? Do they really want it in the first place? And if so, what are the benefits? The benefits must be shared and must be informed by those communities, by those individuals.
Well, I think the younger people and the elders would have two different perspectives. You know, the young people making the music aren't really always thinking maybe they they are sharing their culture, but it might not be the old culture. They might want to be moving forward.
That's true as well. I mean, I would understand is that when culture is a living thing, there are new forms of expression, they are continuously evolving. And again, I think this is a conversation that it should be led by those communities, and if by the young people in consultation with the elders, and non-Indigenous designers like myself. I don't think should really necessarily participate in those conversations. We could participate as moderators or to learn from their perspectives. But the decisions about how technology should be used and why and the benefits need to come from those communities. They are the ones that will be affected after all.
I think they need to be protected in that, right? Because I think there's a bit of naivety about sharing and who's looking at it, and especially with young people.
Yeah. I think that is this sort of naivety, this level of naivety plays across the board in all levels of society. We often engage with technology without full knowledge of the underlying discourses that are operating and like how our data is being appropriated and used, and why. And even more so, that becomes even more at risk when playing within communities that have been exploited by the same mechanisms over a long time. So raising that awareness, I think, is also important as well, which doesn't mean preventing them from using technology, quite the opposite, right? It's a conversation that has to be facilitated with them.
Shared knowledge and shared responsibility, I think.
Yeah.
See a few nods.
Question. Yeah.
I see a few nods around the room. Does anyone else have some insights they'd like to share? Or questions? Well, maybe Professor Hespanhol, maybe you can share a little bit more about where this is going next, how you're building upon this, what are your plans for the upcoming conference?
Yeah, so we are, so in terms of the conference, of course, I hope that's going to be an opportunity to start this conversation with broader community, also outside Australia. And I'm aware that, I mean, that many scholars work with Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars working with Indigenous subjects that in the field of design that might be interested in contributing to this conversation or benefit from our initial work. So I look forward to see what the discussions are gonna be in the context of the conference. But in our immediate context here, as I hinted at during the talk, we plan to apply this proposed framework and validate it. I think at this stage, it's very much theoretical. So we are learning from the literature and trying to reinterpret it, the practices that we have before from this perspective. But that hasn't really been tested, and therefore we cannot really claim that this is appropriate in any way. So we have this. We had to start this conversation with from last year, in fact, with the Ababako community in Lake Macquarie, working with the local council there as well, to develop some storytelling, digital storytelling mechanism. And I mean, first of all, to start a discussion about, is that appropriate in the first place, and how would that be, what the benefits would be, and how should that actually be shaped. It may end up being a very different understanding of digital storytelling from what we normally had in previous processes with other communities. But that will help us to validate some of those initial steps. So that hopefully is going to happen next semester, on the course of the next few months. So I hope to have more to share in a future seminar about that.
A good format to share language, Indigenous language use.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Would you mind just saying that once again?
Oh, sorry. I thought it was a good platform for Indigenous language sharing as well. Like
yes,
a lot of languages being lost, but also a lot of Indigenous people are trying to have living languages, like adding to their languages in modern terms?
Absolutely, and that's one of the factors that have informed. We have this begun with this approach that's much more audio based, so audio technologies rather than visual technologies, precisely because even the appropriate ways of telling some of the stories is orally. It's not visually. Visual expressions demand interpretation that might not have existed before have been appropriate. So we're proposed to start with audio, so audio technologies, audio storytelling. Well, we have been calling it audio augmented reality, but that's just to root it in our current practice. What that's actually going to end up being is going to be a result of the process. We don't want to be preemptive in the way that's going to happen. But the purpose is really to open that up for the community to decide what stories should be told, how they should be told, in which contexts, and why. Why should we share those with the broader Australian community? But we look forward to those discussions.
Well, thank you, Professor Hespanhol. I want to especially thank Professor Grefa and Professor Romo from Ecuador, where it's nearly midnight. So thank you so much for presenting your work with us today, both of you. And I'd just like to invite all of you to join us for our next session, which will be held on May 13th, Hong Kong time, which is May 12th on the Pacific side. And this will feature the Maori Center of Research Excellence, and they'll be presenting on work on Indigenous researchers excellence and forging flourishing Indigenous futures. And this will be presented by Professor Linda Waymarie Nikora of the University of Auckland. So I'd love to see all of you there, and looking forward to continuing these conversations, which I think are very important for our work together. Professor Pereira or Adrian Little, would you like to mention anything before we close? Great. Well, thank you all for joining. I hope to see you all at the next session.
Yes, and I would just echo that. I think they're two fantastic papers. It's been a really great start to the series, and I look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks' time to hear from our colleagues in Auckland.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.